My first guest is Garrett Bain from Gene Canna. Hey, Garrett. Yeah, nice to see you again. We already had a panel in Barcelona, and Garrett is a cannabis, a hemp farmer from Kentucky, USA, and you are sorry, chief sales officer of Gene Canna, and you have 15 years of experience in marketing, technology, sales, and management. You have managed business segments across multiple customer channels with proven record of exceeding multi-million-dollar goals while expanding new businesses lines and profit opportunities. Is that right?
I don't know who sent that, but yes.
And when it comes to regulation, we're talking when it comes to cannabis regulation, and we talk in frameworks, regulatory frameworks. We're talking about a lot of frameworks. Keywords, MRA, GMP, GPP, JAPC, novel food regulation, and so on and so on. You're producing hemp in Kentucky. The USA does not yet have a similar regulation framework like Canada or the European Community has. Is that right? And in which way does that affect especially your international business connections?
Sure. So currently, the foundation of the U.S. market started with some legislation around hemp farming as a crop, right? And that's what we see today under the U.S. Under the Farm Bill that recently passed, legalizing hemp as a crop in the United States federally. Now, you still have state-by-state considerations and state-by-state legislation that needs to potentially align certain states with the federal legislation. Some states have done a really good job of that, Kentucky being one of them. That's why we're there. So they have done a great job of putting a framework together within the state that complements the federal legislation, which has enabled a very successful hemp program, and I believe the model that will be rolled out across the entire United States at some point, as the latent states, the states that have not come on so quickly, realize the economic opportunity for the farmers and for the rest of the tangent businesses are not developing as quickly in their states. They're going to look to other states that have been successful and copy that model. So I think from a legislative perspective, the U.S. has done a good job of paving the way for the crop as an agricultural commodity. What we're waiting on is the FDA to weigh in on what is hemp-derived CBD and cannabinoids. Is it a food? Is it a nutritional supplement? Or is it a drug, right? Or a pharmaceutical? And there is a meeting at the end of May. The FDA is hosting a public comment, and Gene Canna will be participating as well as the U.S. Hemp Roundtable to provide public comment on, where this fits into the economy, how it helps farmers and folks that are using it in the community. So the FDA, we're hoping, goes back, considers these facts, and comes back with guidance that clearly defines. And we're looking for structure. We don't believe it's about safety in the end, right? Food safety, supplement safety, and drug safety. So we don't believe that we're not just asking for carte blanche. We're saying come back with a reasonable framework that we can implement on labels, right? Nutrition fact panels, ingredient fact panels, and something that we can actually put into our business plans as we build and get into mass market retail.
How important is the compliance of your framework with other frameworks, international frameworks, other national frameworks?
Sure. So we've spent a considerable amount of effort and resources in creating a compliant and accredited manufacturing and processing framework from CGMP, BRC, was known as British Retail Consortium at one point. It's a very high level of audit scheme for food grade standards internationally. So we've gone after all of these accreditations and audits in order to create a platform to launch quality, safe products. This industry has been plagued by a trust issue with consumers, right? There hasn't been a lot of trust between consumers and where that product came from. Where was it grown? How was it manufactured? it's kind of been a gray market, right? And I think it's time that folks in this industry rise up and create standards and adhere to global standards of manufacturing that will create trust with consumers and take this industry from being a gray market industry into being a global market industry.
Thank you very much, Garrett. So let me introduce to you Dr. Francis S. Callan. He's the CEO of Cloud9, RxOTC Pharmaceuticals, and also the founder of Cloud9 LLC, ROTC Pharmaceuticals, established in Switzerland in July 2017, and has subsidiaries in Jamaica and France. Besides, he is a member of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines, which makes him an expert on both fields. On the one side, on the economic field; on the other side, on the medical field. So, my first question to you: recently, the framework is about medicine and about product. What would you say needs to be implemented faster on international level? The regulation for medical, international regulations for medical, for cannabis medicines, or regulations for cannabis products on international level?
Good morning, everybody. Just to qualify what Mika just said, we're a company that do two things. We're very active in the field of edibles, and our first products we launched in January of this year in Germany, which is a Swiss chocolate containing the cannabis extract. And we're active in the area of pharmaceuticals as well. But pharmaceuticals is more our medium, longer term business plan. We already have two products that are ready. One is for the treatment of glaucoma, and the other one is for bronchial disorders, asthma particularly. I thought you were actually going to ask me about novel foods.
That's my second question, because we have to do some more time. So
because
I know you're the expert.
The medical front, in a way, is somewhat more advanced than the food area at the moment, particularly since you probably all know that the WHO came out last year. The Expert Committee on Drugs of Dependence came out with recommendations about rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 4, completely delisting it, and also delisting cannabis extracts from Schedule 1, which actually also gives hope to a lot of the CBD players in the world, because if it's off that, then that supposedly can open up some opportunities for the CBD market. Things are moving on the medical front, because in January of this year in the EU, a group of MEPs, they put a motion for resolution to the European Commission that was adopted on the 17th of February for the medical use, the harmonization of the medical use of cannabis medicines in the EU, and also to encourage and promote research in the EU for medicine purposes. So that's moving ahead quite nicely. And don't forget, in the background, you also have GW Pharmaceuticals who have applied for approval for Epidiolex in the EU market too. So that's pending, and we expect something to come in the next couple of months regarding that. So the medical side is moving quite nicely ahead in the EU market. The food side is in a bit of a chaos at the moment. A chaos because since January of this year, everyone's been talking about novel foods this morning. Up until 2018, it was already very complicated and fragmented in terms of the interpretation in different countries in the EU. It got worse in January because the European Commission decided to try and clarify things. I think it was in an effort to clarify. And they made some amendments to what's called the Novel Foods Catalog. So if you go on the internet, you type in Novel Foods Catalog EU, pop up a page, and you can search in there, and you can put in cannabis. And today, there will be 3 references that will come up, 3 entries. One is about the plant, Cannabis sativa L, which is not a novel food. Then there's cannabinoids, and then there's cannabidiol. Cannabidiol has a red mark against it, and cannabinoids has a red mark against it too. They are at the moment up for novel food status, let's say, put it that way. So it's another thing you need to understand, that the catalog itself different from the regulation, because there is an actual regulation.
So let me ask. Let me
That's
ask
the
you
regulation.
a small question in
It
between,
exists.
please,
Yeah.
just for the better understanding. So cannabis sativa L is also listed.
Sure, it's in the catalog, and it's not a novel food. The
It's
plant
not,
is not a novel
so
food. Right.
so if the THC level is in compliance, you could put
That's right.
cannabis sativa L
Sure,
in a food
Sure.
without.
sure. And don't forget, cannabis sativa has been consumed in the European market for centuries. The European Industrial Hemp Association met with the working group. It's called let me see now, it's got a funny name: Plants, Animals, Food, and Feed. That's the name of it. And it's a working group that the Commission deferred to for determining whether a substance is considered novel food or not. So the European Industrial Hemp Association met with that committee on the 12th of March, shared with them basically the usage, the consumption, even industrial quantities of hemp products, hemp extracts in the EU, going back to 1220 in Bologna. It's nothing new. And Mikhail Moziman, I completely agree with what he was saying. It's nothing new.
So what
But-
you actually say is that if you use the term cannabis sativa L instead of cannabidiol, you can circumship the regulation.
So you need to understand your regulations. You need to understand what type of ingredient you're using, what is allowed and what's not allowed. You need to understand the regulation on novel foods. Read it carefully, because it is clear, actually. It is clear. It's a big document, but it is clear. You need to understand the processing conditions. You need to understand labeling, because currently today CBD on a product is not compliant. And the reason it's not compliant, and the reason why a lot of countries in the EU, such as Austria, Italy, Germany most recently, have been marching in with police and removing products from the shelves and fining people and arresting people, is because CBD simply is not yet considered a novel food. The individual substance, the molecule of CBD. If it's called cannabis sativa L, that's fine. That's not a problem. That's okay.
So what you say is you just don't have to put CBD
On a label.
On the label,
That's right.
and
And you avoid a lot of problems.
okay.
So your cannabis sativa,
Smart
of course it contains CBD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to make a note on that, in U.S. it's a similar scenario with a lot of sellers on Amazon actually are selling CBD products, but they're calling hemp extract. It's kind of a sleight of hand, but by not calling out CBD specifically and calling it a hemp extract, they're able to remain as resellers on Amazon.
There's another confusion in the EU space, and it goes back to the change that was made in January in the novel foods catalog. As I said, in 2018 there were only cannabidiol and cannabis sativa L. There was no cannabinoids. So what they did is, in an effort, I think, to clarify, but it actually made it more confusing, they just threw everything into one basket, including extracts. And this is where the confusion also lies.
Does it say cannabinoids in general, or does it define single cannabinoids?
It says cannabinoids in the entry, and inside that entry, they list all different cannabinoids, and they also make reference to extracts also being considered a novel food. And there's also a gray zone, because they don't specifically mention whether it's the leaf, whether it's the flower. So it made it worse. What they did is really made the situation worse. Another MEP, a guy called Marco Zullo from that crazy country, Italy, he wrote to the European Commission. He made an official written request to the Commission to clarify this situation in Europe regarding foods and regarding cosmetics. He did that in March. Now, they're given 6 weeks in order to reply. The 6 weeks was up Friday last. So I would love to be able to tell you some latest hot news this morning, but there is none. There hasn't been any movements in the last month from the European Commission. There's been no, hot news that we can share today.
It's election time.
That's
It's
true.
election time.
That's true. That's
So-
true.
Okay, thank you very much. Our third guest on the panel is Tom Suber from Suber Lawyer in California. He founded Suber Lawyer together with his brother Jeff Suber in 2003. Tom Suber facilitates collaboration among his colleagues and assists them with growing end-client relationship. Mr. Suber also manages intellectual property and disputes and deals around the world and consults clients in relation to global intellectual property portfolios. And as I think I can say, you are specialized also on cannabis regulatory framework in California. And my first question is, how does the disparity of cannabis regulations between federal, state, provincial, and municipal governments complicate cannabis commerce in the USA?
Yes, thank you, Mika. So I was originally asked to speak on an intellectual property panel, so I think that bio was suited for that. But I also, I'm the managing partner of Zuber Lawler, and we've been in the cannabis industry in the U.S. for over 12 years, so we represent many of the biggest players in the U.S. cannabis space. And in that context, I deal with a lot of regulatory work, FDA work, and other work in association with cannabis companies as well as fortune companies. To answer your question, as far as the disparity between federal and state and municipal regulations, cannabis-related regulations in the states, it creates a great big mess. And so I guess in that sense, it's not unlike the EU. So just for folks who don't know, in the United States, there are indeed 3 different levels of regulation. To oversimplify things, you have, of course, the federal regulation, the U.S. regulations, and the FDA is going to, at some point, regulate just about everything. And underneath the federal regulations, you have states. Of course, much like Canada is split into provinces, the EU is split into countries. The United States is split into 50 states plus territories, and each state has its own disposition toward cannabis, CBD products, THC products, and other cannabinoid products. And then even within each state, municipalities differ in the way that they regulate the cannabis, the plant, and products that touch the plant. And so in this context, there's a great deal of variance. So even though the federal government has descheduled hemp, so in the United States, the prohibition of cannabis is affected by what's called the Controlled Substances Act. And cannabis, until recently, CBD as well, has been on Schedule 1 of that act, of the Controlled Substances Act, along with heroin and cocaine. So recently, just this year, the Congress descheduled CBD that's derived from hemp. So long as the CBD product contains less than 0.3% THC, it's categorized as hemp, and that's legal, so to speak. But even still, there are variances in terms of the states and how they regulate hemp. So as an example, in California, you can't just start growing hemp. You can't create a farm to start growing hemp, and that's counterintuitive in some sense. You've got to partner currently with an agricultural research institution, and it's as complicated and complex as it sounds, because there is no pathway to obtain a license to grow hemp in California. So that varies state by state in the U.S. Furthermore, THC is still on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, so it's still treated like heroin, at least theoretically. However, the federal government turns the other way, and so each of the individual states is left to regulate THC-containing products, and there's a great deal of variance among the states. Over 30 states have legalized THC to some extent, whether to a medicinal level or to a recreational level, and then underneath that, the municipalities also differ in the way that they regulate the THC plant. So what you have in the end is really an inability to have a national strategy in relation to a THC product. And what that means, in effect, is that you've got to begin operations de novo in each state. So as to how this affects things, well, as an example, it's awfully difficult to create a brand in the sense that you do in other industries. So if I have well, let's say I'm having a can of Coca-Cola here in Zurich. and I have a can of Coca-Cola in Tokyo or back home in California, I have substantially the same experience, right? I have exactly the same user experience, almost the same brand experience, except for the language differences. In cannabis, if I go to the same retailer shop here in Zurich or in California, the experience within a brand can change month to month. So then, when you consider the fact that in the United States, the regulations vary by state, and furthermore, you can't ship THC across state lines in the US, how much more difficult does it become to create a consistent user experience? And so when you think about it, that's everything that's associated with a brand. So as the cannabis industry grows up, this disparity between federal and state and municipal regulations is going to increasingly become a greater focus for cannabis companies that are going to be more ambitious in trying to create a consistency of user experience underneath the brand across state and sovereign borders.
Thank you very much. So, what we have heard so far in any country or in every country, the national regulations are not homogeneous all over. Are not homogeneous in most countries. Even within the countries, they differ. And on a scale from 1 to 10, Tom, what would you say? How much does that influence the international cannabis business development or the international development of the cannabis business between 1 and 10 points? What would you say?
So I would split that into two answers. One is a THC answer, and I'd say it's a 10. In regard to hemp-derived CBD, I'd say it's still probably a 2. And so in regard to THC, obviously, if you try and ship something across the United States border, you're going to get arrested. So there's that. In regard to hemp-derived CBD, there are still issues. It's legal, but apparently some federal institutions, some United States governmental institutions didn't get the memo that hemp is now legal. So products containing CBD will still get stopped at the border. And so you've got to hire an attorney to go educate relative governmental operatives and say, you know what, this is legal and you need to let it through. And so that's still going on in the United States.
And CBD?
That would be for CBD, correct? So CBD, it should make it through, and you can theoretically ship CBD product across the border. And in fact, our law firm is involved in conversations in relation to a number of territories throughout the world. But you wouldn't assure a client that if you try and ship CBD from here to there across the United States border, that it won't get stopped, because folks are still considering that a drug. And then you've got to explain, no, the farm bill was passed. This is legal now, and you need to let it through. And that's a conversation and an argument and a fight that happens, and it's a function of legacy issues.
My next question goes also to Garrett. We're talking about frameworks, international frameworks. Actually, I did some research. We have enough frameworks. We have MRA, we have GMP, we have GPP in Canada, we have GAMC. So why is cannabis not included or cannot be included in the already existing international frameworks, which are in compliance, actually?
And I think it's starting to, and you're starting to see that movement. For instance, BRC, that accreditation, we just did that for the first time. So it's not that it couldn't be done, it's just that it hasn't been done. And I think GMP is one of those things. You're hearing a lot of the buzzword of GMP all over the world. In the US, we've done
in Canada.
Yeah,
in Canada, you have GPP,
right?
Not GMP.
And so I think you're starting to see, supply chains bridge those gaps internationally. For instance, now we have to get a EU GMP audit company to fly to the United States to do the EU spec GMP audit in order to be in compliance in Europe and not just in the US, which is a different audit scheme. So I think that the industry is very young, but as it matures, you're going to see the international frameworks come together and start working the way that they should. It just hasn't been done yet. And I don't think there's anything barring the industries from doing that for legal products. It just takes time for that to take place.
If I could also add to that, to what Garrett had said, a lot of it in the United States, I think everywhere, comes from a lack of understanding of the plant. And all of this happened so suddenly. And so the current regulatory frameworks that existed absent cannabis don't fit cannabis. So as an example, The FDA has a policy that's existed until today, whereby if something's a drug, it's not a food or a supplement, right? And so then you have a Pedialex, which went through as a CBD drug, and so that's approved as a drug. So that would, according to the FDA, mean that anything else that contains CBD needs to be regulated as a drug. And so the FDA has expressed an intent to make an exception in that regard because there's so much CBD product out there, and I think everyone agrees that that would be a bit silly. So there's going to be some sort of threshold which categorizes CBD beyond that threshold of content as a drug. Perhaps that'll be a function also of the usage of the CBD if it's applied to a particular physiological condition. And then other forms of CBD used for other purposes will still be categorized as food and as supplement. And those are governed by different tracks under the FDA. So that's it. It just goes to show that the FDA was not prepared to receive this type of subject matter, the cannabis subject matter, and as a function of that, it's going to have to change some of the habits that it currently has, meaning some of the policies that have existed to date.
Thank you very much. My next question goes out to Francis. We've heard that the EU is building up a regulatory framework for Europe. We also heard in the long term, the US will set up a regulatory framework which will be similar to the Canadian. So, what do you think? How important is it that the European and the authorities from overseas cooperate so the business can prosper and develop?
It's a good question, and it's also linked to what Tom was just saying, because the way the FDA is approaching it and the way you're anticipating maybe the cutoff between what's a medicine and what's a food or a food supplement, I think the European Commission are going to legislate in the same way. That's going to come later on this year, and that will help to give clarity how it should be approached. And I think at a very high level between the US, between the EU, there are talks between the two trading blocs, and I think there will be a type of an alignment that will come. I'm anticipating this. It's my crystal ball. Okay, so it's not written in stone, but this is, I think, what's going to happen because there's too much at stake. There's too much at stake in terms of tax dollars, in terms of jobs, in terms of a whole new industry that's there and that just needs to be freed a little bit or given clarity and regulations so it can go ahead. Yeah.
My next question is to Keith, and it's a very specific question. In Europe, we have a regulatory framework for seeds. What's going on in the US concerning about for hemp seeds, a regulatory framework? Is there anything planned now, or is the NIDA and IDA still importing seeds from the EU?
In the US, there is no framework like the EU. There is no registered list. We need to remain compliant under the federal guidelines of 0.3% THC or less. But outside of that, you're free to do genetics work, and we do. And I think that the structure of the EU seed list is cumbersome, especially for folks that want to innovate and create more farming and agriculture. So I believe that the U.S. framework is more advantageous for farmers and for the market in general because it doesn't have strict regulations and registrations related to the individual seeds and genetics.
Thank you very much. And let's go to the novel food, the novel food regulation. My next question goes out to Francis because he's the expert on novel food regulation. In the panel before, I estimated after the novel food regulation is implemented, it will take another 2 up to 3 years till all the national laws are implemented. Would you agree? Or do you think there's a different development?
I hope not. I really hope it won't take so long. There has to be a harmonization process, that's true. But it could be accelerated. It could be accelerated because of the changing economic landscape. And for sure, the EU doesn't want to fall behind what's going on in Canada and going on in the US. They want to be competitive, for sure. And you have an important lobby group, the EIHA, again, which is receiving positive feedback from the European Commission. I'm hoping that at EU level, I think the clarification will come within this year, maybe towards the end of the year. But then when it gets translated into the national laws is where it takes time. And that'll take another year.
But as a person who has contact to authorities, you've got the feeling that the EU wants to be competitive.
Yeah,
they want to be.
Sure.
So it's
Sure.
not
There's too much money involved.
It's not like a black sheep
No.
anymore. No, they
No.
want to be competitive.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. My next question goes out to Tom. When we talk about framework, we also have to talk about patents. How do different countries protect plant genetics and other aspects of cannabis of technological value? Do you have any experience in that in California already?
Sure. Well, there in the United States, first of all, there's a funky sort of patent called the plant patent, which is a bit peculiar to the United States. So there are ways to protect plant varieties in the EU and other parts of the world, but as there are in the States. But in the United States, you actually have a particular type of patent that is designed to protect a strain, a set of cannabis genetics that are produced asexually. And so this has been it's this historical oddity. The plant patent exists in the United States to protect a better strain of rose, for instance. Our law firm, Zuber Lawlers, actually just obtained what we believe to be the second ever issued U.S. plant patent for a cannabis strain, which is pretty cool fact tidbit. So in the United States, there are really a variety of ways now to protect the technology associated with the plant. And as we move forward in terms of the cannabis industry continuing to mature from an illegal industry toward a legal industry, a corporate industry, intellectual property is going to intersect increasingly with regulatory frameworks, like, for instance, the FDA. So as an example of that, to take it back to the FDA for a moment and then to come back to patents. The FDA, of course, when you think of the FDA and you think of the approval process, you think typically of the drug approval process, right? Like a Epidiolex, and that's a 10-year process, a 10-year plus process. It's a $1 billion plus process typically, and that's got its a threshold that really typically is only met by a pharmaceutical company, given the enormous resources that a company has to throw at that type of application process. But there are also two other tracks, to oversimplify things, at the FDA that are going to become relevant to cannabis products. You have the NDI track, which is for new dietary ingredients. And what that is basically supplements, right? So supplements that are not quite drugs. So if you have a CBD product that you're using for seizures, like a Epidiolex, that's a drug. If you have a CBD product that you're using for better sleep, that would be considered a supplement. And so typically you would put that through the NDI track, the new dietary ingredient track. At the end of that track, you could even get the ability to make certain claims like helps you sleep better or promotes better energy. And those are called structured function claims. There's a third track, which is called the GRAS track, the generally recognized as safe track. So that applies to foods, like novel foods here in the European Union. And so that track, also, it takes about a year, like the NDI track, and it's much less. It's in the low six figures, maybe $100,000, $150,000 to get it through. So those are reasonable pathways. And when you think about CBD products, THC products, CBN products, these are typically, aside from topical creams and that sort of thing, they're all foods or supplements or drugs. So the FDA will govern everything. And so when we think about patents, the way that they intersect with the FDA processes is, for instance, if you're successful in obtaining an NDI approval for a supplement, say a tincture that you're going to use to help folks sleep better. At the end of that process in the United States, others could ride the coattails of what you've done. So let's say that Francis puts through an application with the FDA. He achieves an NDI approval. He's got a tincture now. He can say it helps you sleep better, and he starts to put that on the shelf. I could come out and say, you know what, I'm going to do what Francis did, and I'm going to go ahead and put my product on the shelf and ride the coattails of that. Well, theoretically, you can use patents and other things to make it more difficult for me to do that. So let's say that Francis's application were to rely on particulars, like, for instance, a particular strain that he's patented. well, then in that sense, it's difficult for me to do exactly what Francis has done without infringing that patent. And so I think what you're going to see as we go forward is a greater communication, a greater intersection between intellectual property and FDA frameworks. I think also what we're going to see is a bit of a reckoning. So what folks may not know out here in Zurich, in the European Union, around Zurich, in the United States and California last July, 90% of the product came off the shelf. I'm going to say that again because it's a phenomenal fact. 90% of the product in legal retail shops were taken off the shelves last July. Why? Because they didn't comply with regulations that came down last July. The amazing phenomenon that's associated with that fact is we all knew it was going to happen. Anybody who thought about it last January or February or March or April or May understood that most of the product was going to come off the shelves in July when the regulations landed. There are some of us in the United States who believe that sort of reckoning is going to happen at the federal level in relation to FDA regulations. And the reason why is because it seems to me and to others that the FDA has to regulate any product that makes a claim that it helps you sleep better, or that it helps you improve energy, or that it improves your gut, or what have you. Because if it doesn't, then the FDA becomes a mockery. So many of these products that are making these claims now, there's going to be some sort of reckoning at some point. And so it makes sense for companies that look to enter the United States to start thinking today about becoming compliant tomorrow, so that you have that advantage that you're that you're among that 10% or that 5% or 20% or whatever that percentage is that's compliant when the FDA decides that they're going to regulate. But rest assured, the FDA will regulate, because all of this stuff is food, it's supplement, it's drug.
Thank you very much, Tom. Garrett, I felt you wanted to add something? Oh, am I wrong?
No, he's exactly right. And, we've been advising our brand partners to lay off the claims, stay away from claims, and stay away from letters from the FDA that, they have sent them out notifying folks that they're making claims that are unsubstantiated. So take a conservative route and wait for the FDA guidelines, food, supplement, or drug.
Can you compare the situation to the European situation, Francis? What do you say?
In a way, yes. Yeah. We have to wait a little bit more to get the clarification. Within this year, I hope to see that at European level. Then, as I said before, it's going to take time to translate that into the national laws. So it will take time. It will take some time. I prefer to be optimistic and positive about this, because there is a lot at stake. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. And if I look on my
can
mobile...
I mention something on the Swiss level?
Because, of course, we are short on time. So
yeah,
sorry.
Because next month, on the 13th and 14th of June, all the cantonal chemists are actually meeting with the federal office in Bern to discuss CBD. To discuss cannabis extracts, CBD, what to do in Switzerland.
So you would also say Swiss authorities want to be competitive, meanwhile?
They have to put clarification as well. They have to do it too. So they're watching what's going on in the EU, because if, on the food area particularly, there is a strong alignment between Swiss legislation and EU legislation also concerning novel foods. And the reason for this is because the biggest export partner for Switzerland is the EU. So again, it boils down to trade and money, taxes. And I think one gentleman earlier this morning said Switzerland is one of the few countries that makes money out of this whole business. It's true.
So thank you very, very much. I don't know. Do we have any?
We have time.
We have time for
check. Yes, we have time for a question or two. Does anybody have a question? I have a question on the intellectual property. I mean, how does it work? Like, cannabis has been decentralized for such a long time. It's always been kind of a open source software for breeders and everything. I mean, there's a couple guys who try to hide some strains or seeds, but usually it just gets out and everybody's all in the mix. I mean, you can't really patent OG Kush or Trainwreck or Bubba or anything like that. So, I mean, how do you decide that you own the rights to a cannabis strain?
Sure, I'm happy to take that one. First of all, that's such a big, exciting question, and
man,
and
I'm very interested.
A couple days answering it, so I'll make a couple of points here as succinctly as I can. First of all, what you pointed out really is a prior art problem, right? The cannabis industry is so novel and strange and wonderful for so many reasons. One of those reasons is that there was a thriving illegal economy around cannabis for decades, right? And so there's all this information out there. However, it was illegal. So there's no prior art. And when I use the term prior art, what I'm referring to is really all the stuff that's out there that the patent office, the U.S. patent office, that analogous patent offices throughout the world will look at to determine if something comprises an invention, right? And so when the patent office sees something today, somebody puts through an application to, let's say, obtain a patent for anything with any product that has greater than 95% CBD content, which is a patent that, for instance, United Cannabis Corp. Has attained. The patent office doesn't know what to do with that because they're not aware that those products have existed because everything was illegal. There's just no prior art out there. And I don't mean to pick on that patent. That's not my point. And it takes that's been through a process of challenge, and it's survived. And United Cannabis Corp. Deserves credit for obtaining that patent. But what I do mean to point out is that what you're looking to really is a prior art question. And in the cannabis industry, you don't have access to the prior art that exists because nobody was talking about the illegal stuff that they were doing, experimenting with cannabis. So that's going to change now. One other thing that I would point out is that the cannabis industry is a technology industry, period. It's just that the cannabis industry doesn't realize it yet, most of it. But the patent litigation is going to affect all of our lives. Anybody who's here with a cannabis product will be affected by patent litigation in some way or another. The reason is because there's so much technology in that plant, and there's so much technology that lies between the plant and the human physiology that we don't yet comprehend. And so many of the patents, well, there are a few patents today that are celebrated. But in my view, and in the view of some of my colleagues, these patents are not necessarily capturing the substance of the technology that's inside the plant, in the sense that they're speaking to isolated cannabinoids. One of the things that's so fascinating about the plant is how complex the interaction is between the different cannabinoids, terpenes, and ballast, and other biochemicals in the plant, and the way that these interactions between these biochemicals affect the degree to which different cannabinoid receptors within the human body take up a cannabinoid. So as an example, isolated CBD, which is taken up by the CB2 receptor, not to geek out too much, I'll try and keep this as simple as possible, is not really taken up that well. So the reason why, if you take a CBD product or you give it to your mom or your grandmother and they say, I don't feel anything, that's not surprising, because an isolated CBD compound does not get taken up well by the CB2 receptor. However, you add a bit of THC and all of a sudden the receptivity of the CB2 receptor to CBD increases.
The entourage effect.
The entourage effect. And that's really an understated way of putting it, but that's true. And the thing to keep in mind is that there are over 100 cannabinoids in the plant. There are many receptors in the human body that take up cannabinoids, but we've only studied 2. We can only currently test for between 13 and 28 cannabinoids, depending on who you ask and how you're counting. So what that tells you is there's so much that we don't yet understand. That technology is going to get patented. And that's we're going to start to see increasingly interesting patents speaking toward the interactions between cannabinoids, terpenes, ballast, and other biochemicals in the plant, the way that they interact with particular human physiological conditions. And as these patents land, they'll be enforced, and all of us will be affected.
Thank you for keeping it very simple.
And just a note on that, we've actually just started the process on we announced a 0.0% THC cannabis strain in conjunction with the University of Kentucky, and that's under the patent process at the moment. So that speaks to the genetics and the plant side of that, and not as much to the receptor and to the entourage effect.
Thank you.
Yeah, one more question.
Do we have one more? Oh, yep. Thank you.
Just on the 3 components or whatever that are registered under the Novel Foods book, was it, or
The
catalog?
Yeah, there's 3 entries.
Cannabis sativa L is defined as what?
The plant. Yeah. That's a little bit ambiguous. You're right.
Because there are 63 varieties.
69.
69 varieties.
In the common registry.
Yeah. But the plant itself is Cannabis sativa L.
Correct.
And that is not 69 varieties.
So there's two things. There's a common registry, which Garrett was referring to earlier in the EU. So for crops and for consumer products, you have to use a plant that's listed on that registry for it to be compliant with EU regulations. And that's why you have things like EU certified hemp, because it's a hemp variety that's on that list. But novel foods is another regulation. It's a complete different regulation. It has nothing to do with, there's no bridge between the two. So when they talk about cannabis sativa L, they talk about it as its use in food products. And it talks about whether you can use the seed or whether you can use the leaf or the stalk or the root or the flower. And this is, and the problem with the entry in the catalog is that it doesn't explicitly say some things to make it clear what you can use or what you cannot use. So by absence, it's quite ambiguous to understand what is meant by that. This is the problem that's linking with that entry in the catalog. Okay. Fantastic.
Great. Thank you all so very, very much. We're unfortunately out of time, but that was very informative.
Thank you very much.